Banditos. Welcome to the Wednesday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and today we have a writer for you. You know him. His name is Jim Krueger. And where do you know him from? You know him from Earth X, the trilogy, which he wrote along with Alex Ross's concepts, became a huge hit of kind of an alternate future story of the Marvel Universe, somewhat in the vein of Kingdom Come from DC. And then you also know him from Justice, another collaboration with Alex Ross, where they dive deep into the Justice League of America. But you may not know that Jim Krueger has done a lot of work throughout comics on things like Avengers, X-Men, other licensed properties like Star Wars, The Matrix, of course, Batman. And he has original projects like many do these days, and he's jazzed about that as he should be. Things like the Foot Soldiers, Alphabet Soups, The Clockmaker, The Runner, The High Cost of Happily Ever After, The Last Straw. He is a font of story and storytelling and knowledge about the industry. He came up as an advertiser, a copywriter before he broke into the narrative part of comics. So he has an interesting perspective from that. But let's stop talking and let him get a word in edgewise. This is Jim Krueger. To have Jim Krueger with us. Jim, how are you?
So good. So happy to be here.
I am very happy to have you here. And we're going to kick off the questioning with our typical first one, which is, how did you first discover comic books?
Probably there's two versions of the story. The first one I think is my dad had an auto mechanic garage, and so I grew up like surrounded by cars and that kind of thing. But even when I was like little, like 5, 6 years old, he would sometimes come home with his tow truck and put all the lights on, and he'd be like, "I need someone to hold the rag while I hook up the cars," and that kind of thing. You know, it's about time you started working. It was like that kind of thing. And so he would come home, and take me on tow jobs to go and tow in cars. And his payment for me, there was always like a comic sitting on, or two that were sitting on like the seat for me to find when, I got into the tow truck. So that's story version number one. The second version is there was one point because we all worked really hard. Well, my dad worked really hard, and my mom, I think, really kind of said to him, you know, you need to take time with the kids. We need to do a family vacation and that kind of thing. And so we ultimately, and there's more to the story that I'm happy to share, but she's like, we need to do a family trip. And so a train trip was planned to go from where I grew up in Wisconsin to Florida to go to Disney World. And the idea is that we would take a train to Chicago, and then get on a different train from Chicago to Orlando. And when we hit Chicago, my dad bought myself and my brother 2 comics. And this is like significant now, but one comic was Batman, which my brother got, and the other comic was Superman, which I got. And so I was so pissed at my brother about that. I was like, why does he get Batman? Batman's so much cooler, but I don't believe that anymore. I'm full on Team Superman.
Nice. Okay, we don't take sides over here, but we definitely, I would say at least one of us leans very much more Superman over Batman. But I wanted to follow up and ask if you have any of those from either scenario, those sort of original comics, including that Batman, that Superman one, or maybe even your brother's Batman.
Yeah, so I remember exactly what they were. One of the comics that I was given, or that I got, was Commandy #7, the King Kong issue. That was a toe job comic. Um, and it's crazy because that entire comic is just a giant rip of King Kong, um, except that it's not the love story between King Kong and Fay Ray. It's kind of King Kong looks at Commandy as his toy that he doesn't want to lose. But
Right.
other than that, it was the entire King Kong story set in the Commandy universe. And Mark Waid actually helped me with figuring out what the Superman comic was that I got. And I can't give you the number, but it was the first appearance of the Human Target, because the only memory
Okay.
I had of it was the guy with the heart shaped, the killer with the heart shaped tattoo on his cheek. And of course, Mark Waid was like, "Oh yeah, that's action number blah 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 blah." But so I have a special love for the Human Target now. I may never forgive Tom King.
um, that's great. So, from what I read of your biography, you don't, as some do and some don't, didn't jump right into comics. As a young adult, you got a journalism degree from Marquette, where my dad went, actually. Then you started
Amazing.
into advertising, right?
Yep, I started in advertising. There was one agency that I worked at a little bit, but really my first agency experience was at this great advertising agency called Jacobs and Ross in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and I'm still buddies with Trig Jacobson, who runs, who had the agency and he sold it since, and he started like a ginger health drink company since, and he's still this giant part of the Sheboygan community. But yeah, those were special, kind of crazy days.
But you end up taking some of that experience to become or to break into the comics industry as a copywriter at Marvel. And for
Yes.
those who can't make the or have not made the distinction between a writer, which we know, writer of the comics, and a copywriter, what did that job entail for you? Which was not probably at that point writing the comic books, right?
Right. It wasn't writing comic books, but it pretty much so entailed promoting the comic books and promoting the comic book sales by writing things like house ads or special projects or things like that. So there were some things that I wrote, whether that were related to comics, that were ideas. But I keep on thinking that maybe I need to even put a book together of my favorite ads um, that I wrote while at Marvel, like there were giant campaigns that we did. And what was great is that the guys who ran our department were like classic madmen. They were like classic advertising people from like 70s and 60s advertising, in New York. Like one of my bosses was had been a writer on the Johnny Carson Tonight Show, you
Oh,
know,
really?
and wrote like classic ads. Maybe a lot of people don't remember these lines, but like sometimes you feel like a nut, sometimes you don't, was one of his lines.
And
Um,
Joy's got nuts. Mounds
yep,
don't.
yeah, and then he also created like Count Chocula and Frankenberry and Cereal and Boo Berry, and he was even in the ads. He was even the voice of Boo Berry.
Wow.
And then that was on the writing side, but on the design side, um, the other guy in charge of it, he would be like, and I should say on the writer side, it was Jim Brennan, who was this famous ad guy, and
Okay.
it's Vito Incorvaya on the design side, and he's the guy who came up with like the design for Legs pantyhose, that it should come in an egg, and the special,
Right.
blah 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 blah, and these guys were just so talented and so good. And I was so lucky that they didn't know a lot about comics, because once I got the job, they kind of just let me go with it. Anytime there was like a special thing, they were like, "Okay, Jim, what should we do?" Blah 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 blah. They would add in all their professional ideas and knowledge and stuff like that. But I got to do things that I should never have been allowed to at that point, including helping form the beginning ideas of the MCU.
That's pretty awesome and impressive. And, I think that would probably rank up there with, discovering or creating Count Chocula and Booberry.
Oh, well, that's very kind. That's very kind. I don't know. Count Chocula is pretty special.
Yeah, I mean, those are some big credits. I don't
Yeah,
want to disparage.
Frankenberry. Oh my gosh, Frankenberry. What a name.
I wonder if we actually overlapped at Marvel, because I was there from 2000 to 2002, a short 2 years.
Okay,
But
so we
I
missed
did
each
work.
other.
Did we miss each other? Okay.
Yeah,
Because I was
because I
looking
was.
up some of your credits and I was thinking maybe you had worked with collected editions and written some of the, synopses for things like Captain Britain or Doctor Strange, or some of the, first collected editions that were coming out of that shop.
I did write. some back cover copy.
So
For the back of
interesting.
those
Maybe
collected
I
editions.
inherited it from you, but you were already gone at that point. But either way, at the same time, from what I've read, you're also studying filmmaking at NYU, right? And
Yep.
having a little bit of success there. Did you, while you were doing both, did you ever think that you would come to a point where you had to sort of ditch comics or ditch filmmaking in order to concentrate on sort of one avenue?
No, I always just thought, there are always different ways to tell stories, and filmmaking allowed me one way to tell a story, and that's really where I grew as a world builder and kind of built a reputation as a world builder. But you know, like I'm writing prose now too, and there's always different ways to tell a story, and I think what I really like to do is find ways to do that and try to use every way, every imaginable way of telling a story, and figure out how to do it with, I don't know, my brand or my approach or the things that strike me as important when you tell story in any kind of medium.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. And I think there are, hate to use this sort of like business speak, but transferable skills from one medium to the other when it comes to writing and telling a story. So back to the sort of comic side, when did the transition occur from copywriter, ad copywriter, to writer of comics? What was your first work in that, and how did that come about?
It was I want to say it was both a slow and a fast transition. It was one of those things in which, before I even got to Marvel, I developed something called Foot Soldiers, and I had already written scripts for this idea I had called Clockmaker, and I had already kind of developed the ideas for something called Alphabet Soups, and these were my three things, even before getting into Marvel. And what's great is that because I grew up in Wisconsin, I would go to the comic shops there, and I would print out the scripts I was writing and let them read it. And the guys at Capital City Comics, both, and I'm not talking about the distribution, but I'm talking about the actual comic shops. There was one in Madison, and there was one in Milwaukee, and I would share my scripts with both, and they would comment and they would read and they would give me thoughts, and I enjoyed it. It was like lots of fun. But still, at that point, I never dreamed that I would get to write comics and do it. I was just happy to work in the industry. I was happy to, be writing about some of my favorite things. And then there was a guy named Lou Bank who worked at Marvel, who left Marvel and worked and ultimately went to Dark Horse. And when I would go to conventions, I designed the characters of the Foot Soldiers. Every time I met a favorite artist who I loved, whether it was Tim Sale or Walt Simonson or Tom Morgan or Mike Allred or like just the people I was meeting and stuff like that. I would pay I think it was like $40 then, $50 then for a sketch. It's so much more now. But and I'd get them to draw my characters. And then I love Mike Parabeck. And so I reached out to Mike Parabeck to pencil a 3-page story I did. And so I kind of created a pitch deck immediately. I kind of created a book that was like, this is Foot Soldiers and that kind of thing. And in the midst of it, I wrote a couple small short stories for Marvel. I was even invited to write something at Acclaim, which got me in all kinds of trouble because I was still on staff at Marvel. But again, my bosses were like, "Look, Jim's working hard. He's such a good worker. We really need him. He's necessary to our department. We'll have a talk with him so he doesn't do any more freelance." And so bit by bit, I was kind of allowed to get away with stuff I probably shouldn't have, and been able to. And then Dark Horse said, "Yeah, Jim, we'll do Foot Soldiers. Come and do Foot Soldiers with us." Based on that document that I had created, which I remember pitching to Bob Schreck at one of the cons, and Bob immediately said, "Yes, of course we'll do it." And it was 3 pages. Mike Parabeck penciled it, and Teddy Christensen inked it, and it just turned out beautiful. Like it turned out really, really beautiful. And what was interesting was because I was still on staff, is people would come down to my office who read it and would say, "Don't tell anyone I told you this, but I really love it." Like Mark Grunwald said, and this Mark Grunwald came down when we were promoting and developing Captain America and stuff like that, and he was like, "Jim, this character you created, I've never seen this character in comics before. That's quite a feat." And
Wow, that's
so,
high praise.
yeah, and it's Grunwald who knew everything about Marvel and every character ever. So it was like there was this transition. Can I swear on this show?
Go ahead.
Okay, well, there was one point in the midst of this. So I'm writing these little stories, and then I'm also doing things like helping with the development of the Marvel Vision magazine, which was kind of Marvel doing their own version of Wizard and that kind of
Right.
thing. And there were aspects of that magazine that Alex, who I had already developed a friendship with, because my first job at Marvel was to help promote Marvels. And so he and I became
Okay.
friends immediately. And the first time we hung out at a con, we talked about our love for 70s Jack Kirby and Machine Man and all that kind of thing. So Alex really loved this one thing related to Marvel, or related to the magazine, Marvel Vision, and he had been asked post Kingdom Come. And what's great about my friendship with Alex is, like, I remember taking long walks with him at cons as he's pitching me early ideas for Kingdom Come. And he would ask my opinion, and what do you think about this? And should I do this? And all that sort of thing. And his initial thoughts on having James Robinson write it, before Mark Waid became the writer on the project, and all that kind of thing. And thank God Mark did such an amazing job. Anyhow, that's an aside. But I love James too. So it's like,
Sure.
regardless, it's really cool. So Alex loved that thing, and Wizard Magazine had contacted Alex and said, "Can based on how the DC characters had aged for Kingdom Come, he was asked to do a Marvel version of it. What would the Marvel characters look like when they aged?" And so Alex, who liked the thing I was doing by doing like an alternate history and stuff like that, to this thing called Time Slip in Marvel Vision, said, "Well, Jim, this is our chance to finally work together. Why don't you do this?" He said, "It's not a real project. It's not going to be anything. It's just this article." And so I wrote, these things, related to maybe the 10 or 12 sketches, when Alex's sketches are way beyond sketches. They don't even count as sketches. They're like penciled visions, that are so good. And he just was like, "Yeah, why don't you write this?" and then the president of Marvel at the time, who was Joe Calamari, and this was that
Yep.
era in the late '90s when the presidents were changing like every 6 months, every
Yeah.
year, because Marvel was going through its bankruptcy period. Um, he just looked at the whole thing when he saw it from Wizard, and he just said, "Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it as a real project." And Alex was like, "It's not a real project. I don't have a story." And then there was one night I had recently um, had a daughter and was so used to all the biological terms and all the reproductive terms of, you know, placentas and this and all that sort of thing. I was like, oh, Earth is an egg. Superheroes are
Gestation. Yeah.
antibodies to protect the Mother Earth. It all, and I just remember calling Alex, and Alex didn't answer because I think he was out at the time. But I left message after message on his answering
Yeah.
machine, pretty much so, just explaining all the central aspects of Earth X. And then he called me back the next day, and he goes, "Wow, it's a real project." Okay, and then
I mean,
internally, and this is where the swearing comes in, you know, editorial, who's already upset with me because of Foot Soldiers, already upset that I was doing like freelance books, and certainly I pitched Foot Soldiers to everyone at Marvel, and they found a loophole in the code of conduct that said, you know, if you're not editorial and you pitch the project to editorial and they said no, you can go out and do it somewhere else. Like that was in the code of conduct of Marvel.
mhm.
So like that was anyhow. I went by this one editor's office as he was getting the call from, I think, Tom Brevoort, telling him about the project EarthX that Alex was going to do all the designs and the covers for, and I was writing it, and I just heard this voice inside go, "Fuck Jim Krueger." And I took that as, I mean, it hurt. At the same time, I took it as a compliment and said,
Right.
you know what? I just really want that "fuck Jim Krueger" to turn into "fuck Jim Krueger."
Yes. The comma
So,
makes all the difference.
right?
That's an amazing story. How that project came together when it wasn't even a project, and just taking the influence um, from Kingdom Come, and then just taking an idea. I mean, these sketches of ideas, and making a fledged project out of that. Once you got into it, once you got the green light, and this was something that was going to happen, at least the first miniseries. Um, what How difficult was it to balance that many characters and maybe that many storylines, and make it something sort of cohesive and coherent?
Well, it was, I mean, first of all, there was a central idea of the purpose of human beings on Earth, the purpose of the mutated human beings on Earth. I mean, you know, Alex initially had the idea. He said, "I have no story to this," but I think he was frustrated with how crazy in the early '90s everyone was with X-Men and mutants and stuff like that. And so he was just like, "We're going to call it Earth X because everyone's a mutant now." And then he said, "I have no story." So,
There you
so
go.
it's like so. Here was the puzzle. Here was these 12 sketches, these 12 classic characters, and who had all mutated or changed. Um, but I had this central idea of the big story. The Earth is egg. The vibranium is placenta. Superheroes as antibodies to protect the mother, and all related to the Celestials, um, and all related to, because whenever I work with anyone, I really try to listen to what's important to them. And so Alex and I were talking all the time about 70s Kirby and Jack Kirby, and almost how Eternals, when the Eternals came out, it completely changed or it felt like it completely changed the origin of the Marvel universe, you know. And so Alex's dad was a pastor, um, and so there was some biblical aspects that he brought, and certainly being a Midwesterner, I was brought up in some of that tradition too. And so there was a sense of how do we do something that has such an epic play, because the Marvel universe is kind of, it's not a godless universe, but it's kind of a godless universe. So the all the ideas of creation and adaptation and evolution and stuff like that play themselves out in very different ways than perhaps the DC universe. So it was like grabbing that lore and grabbing that mythology and ultimately dealing with the Watcher, and who had seen it all and would probably have all the secrets and would have a reason why he never got involved in human affairs, even though he did, but it was to save the planet. It was playing that out. And then one of the things that Alex would always say is, he said, let's when you go to these characters and you write these characters, go to the original version of them. And when you go to like the original, the first time we see the Watcher, it's his face stretched across that screen on the moon, and the Watcher doesn't come off as a good guy. He comes off as a bad guy. And so that began to like form how I wanted to write the Watcher, and how to approach him, and all that sort of thing. And so
this is first. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that. And as far as the other characters go, and having so many characters together in one book, it was almost like, because there's an origin sequence that kind of tells the history of every character at the beginning of each issue of Earth X. It was kind of like this idea that as the Watcher's telling the origin of these characters in this discussion with Earth X, or I'm sorry, with X-51, the Machine Man, it was kind of like, okay, the origin has to be revealed so people know the character, but at the same time, the Watcher knows something that X-51 doesn't about these heroes, and the audience doesn't know about these heroes too. So it was like, I'm going to write this with the nuance that we don't know everything. And it was ultimately, as it begins with the origin of the character, Earth X was also writing to the Earth X was also speaking to kind of the destiny of the character, and so there was a chance to grab, just those key pieces of history that are important to the character, and then give the twist in such a way that, okay, what's the destiny of the character, and then how is this still true to that original design that Alex did? And so it was like filling those things in,
yeah,
and figuring it out.
It's interesting that there was both the sort of character-based, focused storytelling that was happening in terms of the histories of the characters, and how they became who they became, but also this sweeping. And this is the first time I'm thinking about this, the way of thinking about this in how you're describing it, sort of operatic, story, and I guess just this, as I said, sort of sweep of almost like future history, right?
Yeah.
Combining the two of them makes it, I feel like, all the more engaging. Because you can get really stuck up in the air with these, larger concepts. And similarly, you can get, too far in the weeds on one particular character, but sort of marrying those two and keeping sort of both views in tandem, I think, is what really is the kind of special sauce of this particular story and storytelling.
Thank you for saying that. I think, and this goes back probably to my dad and that auto mechanic garage again, like when I was 10. He was like, okay, you have to start working. So every Saturday morning, I would go to the garage with him. I'd get the donuts across the street. How many, I'd see if there were any new comics on the spinner rack, because he'd always, give me a couple bucks to buy more comics on the spinner rack across the street. And then we would never leave the garage, even though I'd be cleaning, air hoses and sweeping up and doing all that. We would never leave his shop, until after we heard Paul Harvey do the rest of the story, which was this segment in which he told of a character in history and a mini story, and you wouldn't even find out who the character was until the end of his 5-minute story, and then you'd be like, "Oh my gosh, such irony! I had no idea." Blah blah blah. It would be like a secret piece of history, and I think that really formed how I wanted a story to be. That there had to be surprises, and there had to be a sense of what's important, like always writing the character in a way that no matter how much had changed, they were still that character we loved.
Yeah.
So.
Definitely makes a lot of sense. Was this envisioned from the beginning as a trilogy, or was it more, let's see how this did? It did really well. Let's do another. That did really well. Let's do another.
Yeah, it was kind of like that. I mean, we definitely, in the midst of Alex and I talking back and forth and all that sort of thing, and Earth X I want to say Earth X was more, despite the sketches, which certainly launched everything. Earth X was pretty much so just me. I would send Alex the scripts after I finished them, and he would just call me back, and there'd never be a note at all. It was like unbelievable. He was so excited about these scripts. But then when we started planning Universe X, Alex had all kinds of extra ideas for the characters. And so we got to the point where with Universe X and Paradise X, Alex was much more involved in the plotting too.
Got it.
So it was more like in the midst of writing Earth X, we were like, well, what could we do after this? And both Alex and I love Captain Marvel, the original Captain Marvel. And so you see in Earth X us planting the seeds, for something Marvel was going to do. And then part of it was also just being like, I have this big belief that like everyone always talks about the consequences of doing the wrong thing or the consequences of mistakes. I'm always like, there's a consequence to saving the world. There's a consequence to doing the right thing. So then I would look at the characters and I would be like, okay, they saved the world in Earth X, but what are the consequences of this? Yeah. What's the fallout of saving all of life on Earth? And what does that mean? And how do we take it further? And how does that cause other problems? And then how do we solve those problems? And so it just moved on like that. Like, even the prequel that we just did a couple years ago, Marvel's X, Alex and I had the idea for Marvel's X, and just the notion of how we were going to reveal the identity of Daredevil, who everyone was wondering about in the midst of the trilogy, how we would do that. And so we talked about that for years and years and years.
And it came out when it had to come out.
Yeah, during a pandemic. Well, it's its own story of a pandemic.
So, at the time, I feel like this was a, fresh, new, bold approach. These sort of alternate future timelines. We didn't know if it was alternate or not, but and since then, I think so many places, so many properties, so many stories have sort of taken that baton and run with it, and sometimes to varying degrees of quality. Do you think that this kind of I hesitate to even call it sort of dystopian future, but this sort of alternate future, let's call it, timeline sort of storytelling has become a little too saturated in genre storytelling?
Oh, I don't even know how to answer that because every time I think, oh, we've seen this before, someone else comes up with something that we kind of haven't seen before, and it's fantastic. Um, so I don't know what I'm really grateful that Earth X has had so much influence in not only the regular Marvel universe and comics, but also in the MCU. You know,
Yeah.
Everything from Moon Knight's costume for the TV series to certainly the spine of Eternals, the movie, to
Hmm.
there were lines from Earth X that showed up in one of the Thor movies, to chubby Peter Parker in the Into the Spider Verse, to like
Yeah.
there are just so many things, and now we're going to see the female Silver Surfer as well in the
Yeah.
Fantastic Four movie.
You're absolutely right. I mean, this particular project certainly proves that there are ways of doing this kind of storytelling that really resonate and can have implications beyond just the project that is happening right now. So, um, I, I I think I agree with what you're saying, which is to say that as long as the stories are good and there are fresh spins on what these type of future projects are, then why not go for it? And there are ways to do this successfully, even now, even if we've seen other stories like this previously.
Well, and I always go back to Alan Moore's introduction for Dark Knight Returns, which really influenced me in even the creation of Foot Soldiers. But anyhow, Alan Moore talks about how a character in literature doesn't become a legend until we know how they die. It's like
Mm.
Reichenbach Falls with Sherlock Holmes. Even though they brought Sherlock Holmes, that's still that epic ending. Or it's the last arrow that Robin Hood shoots to determine where he'll be buried. Like that whole thing is what Alan Moore talks about. And so the idea of seeing heroes grow old, of seeing heroes die, um, and is fantastic and exciting. And up until recently, we really, in I guess since Earth X, if you want to give it that much credit, um, we really only experienced that in like What If. That was the chance to
Yeah,
see what if a hero dies at the end. But how much of What If has influenced, the MCU and Marvel as well?
that's
Whether
true.
it's what if Gwen Stacy hadn't died, or what if Jane Foster had picked up the hammer of Thor, or any of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to this sort of multiverse, this just sort of insatiable curiosity for how things that we know so well could be so different with
Right,
one change of a situation, or one
right,
change of a character decision or something like that. And
yeah,
so that's it's always interesting to me, and I can only see with the success of these multiverse type movies and comics and things that it is certainly of interest to a lot of other people as well.
yeah,
I love
totally.
it. But moving on, in terms of the chronology of your career after Earth X, is that you did have a couple other projects with Alex. First, you
Yeah,
did Justice
yep.
with DC Comics.
Which is I'm so proud of that and so happy about that. And it won the Eisner for best collected graphic novel, which is great. And here's the best thing about the Eisners. If you win an Eisner, you get to bring friends into Comic-Con. So, no what matter where I live in the world, I always have to go to Comic-Con just to get my friends in.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean that's a great reward, and a very practical one too. So fits in.
Yeah, especially
Um,
when tickets sell out so immediately, and you know people can't come
and
in,
there's
and the tickets are
yeah,
still already like $400-500 for the weekend.
yeah. It's insane.
So
I,
grateful.
I haven't been in probably 15 years. I went a long time ago, but I haven't been since because of it selling out and also the astronomical prices. But I
And
know it is,
hotels.
one
And
of a kind.
hotels. Yeah.
Yeah. So Justice, though,
Right.
can you tell me a little bit about the genesis of that project and whether that was something that was you coming to Alex with something, Alex coming to you guys just
Oh,
sort
that
of
was, by the way, that was
on
like
you?
totally Alex coming to me. He's like, here's our thing. I know that Alex says that he really wishes every time he goes back to Earth X, he really wishes he had painted it. So I think he wanted to do a painted project together, and that was it. But really, Alex wanted to do Super Friends. He said, let's do a serious Super Friends. Let's do Super Friends. And then it was kind of the idea of, okay, how do we do this? And he had like, if you remember at the end of like the fourth issue, there's like Metallo and Parasites, um, and I forget who the third person is, and they're taking down Superman, and Superman cries for help, and that's how issue 4 ended. Alex had figured out that way exactly how to bring Superman down. And there's another battle sequence later on that Alex had completely choreographed. Um, so again, Alex was much more involved in in some of the plotting and the choreography of that one. But then it was like the more I thought about even that phrase "super friends," the more I started thinking, well, what's what's the difference between the Justice League and the Legion of Doom? How do those things, how do you have a collective of villains when by their nature they're all selfish and betrayers versus the Justice League? And so that kind of set me on this idea of okay, they have to be psychically being controlled, which led to Brainiac and Gorilla Grodd and those kind of characters ultimately controlling and creating a false community, because community seemed to me to be something that villains are incapable of, criminals are incapable of on some sort of basic level. And then versus the Justice League, who it is about community. And that's why when you read the whole thing, you see the villains, um, who begin as this community, becoming more and more splintered by the end, where the Justice League, it just keeps on expanding. We're all of a sudden dealing with the Metal Men and the Doom Patrol and Metamorpho and other characters and the sidekick characters and even the Legion of Superheroes by the end. Looking back on the story, like it's this idea that friendship and goodness is an ever expanding universe where villainy and criminal acts is a constantly splintering universe and broken off universe. And so that became a big thematic thing as we talked about tragedy and trauma and all that kind of thing in the midst of the story.
Yeah, you can make the argument that the superpower of the Justice League and other teams is their community, is their teamwork.
Totally,
That's what
totally.
makes the whole thing work, and that's
Yeah,
why the villain team ups, if you will, or even groups, just they're never going to work that way because they're sort of the inverse. Community is not their motivating sort of factor, or even they're something that they can put together
yeah, yeah,
in order
totally.
to achieve their goals.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's totally what I was thinking.
Let me ask you, if coming from Earth X to Justice, were there any lessons that they were very different projects. I mean, some similarities in terms of, the people behind the two projects, but were there any lessons that you took from Earth X, or the trilogy in general that you applied to Justice in terms
Yeah, no, no,
of,
no.
well,
That's
yeah, story or sort of how you worked?
um you know what? It's actually a lesson that was there in Earth X and once again there in Justice. Um it was really thinking about, we have all these characters. We have all these characters in both projects. So when one speaks, when one speaks, when one has dialogue, I always had like two rules. One was, is this advancing the story? Is this pushing the story forward? But also the other thing is, what's a statement this character would make that reminds us why we love this character in the first place? So it became like, how do I define this character in just one piece of dialogue? And I mean, that goes back to advertising and, sometimes having to write a headline in 7 words. Um, what's, like, there's that point, I think in issue 12, where Superman goes up against Toyman's robots, you know, and he's like, I'll stop them. It's my job. And it dating back to the cartoon, this is a job for Superman, but finding those key little moments that help us remember either the power they have, an origin, or a chapter in their life that's really important, or whatever.
That's great, and I thought it would be something character driven, given that what you were saying about the Earth X sort of character introductions, and then kind of mapping a little bit of that that structure onto Justice in some way in terms of that character focus. So you again worked with Alex Ross on Project Superpowers for Dynamite, and we could talk about that project specifically, but I kind of wanted to, now that we've talked almost ad nauseum about this collaboration, what makes it work so well? Why is it such a fruitful collaboration between you and Alex? What makes it tick?
I guess it goes back to this idea at the beginning, that I said that when I collaborate, I really listen to who I'm collaborating with. I never assume this is my story. I assume this is our story. And so I'm failing as a writer if I'm not listening to the person I'm working with. And so I think, and Alex has said this a number of times, he's like, Jim, you're the only writer I've ever worked with who really embraces my ideas. And so, if you look at those 12 character sketches, at the beginning that led to Earth X, it's when Alex gives me an idea or says, this is an idea I had, this is something I wanted to see done with this character, I had this, I'm like, okay, that's a piece of this puzzle I have to make work.
Right.
And so it's the respect, it's really the respect for Alex, it's the respect for who I'm collaborating with, it's the respect and the recognition that it's not my story, it's our story, regardless of who I'm working with.
Yep. So when not working on these, huge, expansive, super-powered projects, although these other projects are probably involve superpowers, you also work with a number of major properties, including Avengers, X-Men, Star Wars, Matrix, Batman. The list goes on. How do you choose your projects? Is it based on a collaborator? Is it based on a character? Do you have to have an idea, or do you relish the challenge of maybe being a little scared of not having an idea? How do those projects, how do you choose?
Well, one, I want to say I always have an idea because I live in constantly generating stories I really want to tell, I really want to get behind, or I have a sense of, oh, this is a piece of dialogue that has to happen. This is a thing that has to happen. I can't wait to tell this story. And there are like stories I've waited like 10, 15 years to tell before the opportunity kind of finally came up or comes up. So it's more a case of just I one, always have an idea, and two, this is also not just show business, it's show friends. Like, part of the whole collaborative process is collaborating with your editor and working with them and trying to have the best possible relationship you possibly can have with them, and recognize that when they give notes, it's usually because there's a problem in the story that has to be addressed. So I never come to a note that like an editor gives without, like, they may make a suggestion, and then I'll want to have conversation with them and be like, hey, can we talk about that? If we change that based on your suggestion, that might unbalance this other area of the story, and I know you like that part, so can we just talk between the two of us about figuring it out, and maybe we can come up with a solution. And as far as artists go, I always look at what an artist does and what they've done in the past, and I try to write towards their specific sensibility, because I want their story to look fantastic, and not only that, be something they're proud of showing off. I never want to work with an artist. I never want to work with an artist for whom it's just a gig for them.
Yeah, I've said it a million times before, and people are probably wincing at me saying it again, but you can tell when people have, or creators have, skin in the game, and they're not phoning in. They have some passion behind the work. It comes out on the page in so many instances. Within these other non Alex Ross collaborations, are there any that stand out to you as sort of particular favorites in your sort of au revoir?
Yeah, well, you know what, I've mentioned Foot Soldiers a couple times already, and certainly every time I'm at a con, I get someone, at least one person comes up to me and says, Jim, I know you're famous for all this other stuff, but man, Foot Soldiers is my favorite thing. And that always feels really good. But a couple other ones that I really love is there's this thing I wrote called The No Ones that almost no one has heard about. And it came out from a really small publisher who didn't even promote it the way they should have, or deal with it the way they should have. But that's the story. And basically, it's about a team of superheroes who are like celebrity heroes. It's not like The Boys where they're all a-holes or something like that. It's more like they're celebrities. They're Fantastic Four. They're like that kind of celebrity with all their corporate sponsorship and stuff like that, and their own paparazzi and that kind of thing. And in the midst of the story, they're fighting terrorists in the subways beneath New York City, and they accidentally kill an innocent bystander. And then they're like, oh, once this hits the news, everyone's gonna be, we're gonna lose our sponsorship, we're gonna lose even our ability to save lives. So for the sake of trying to save everything, they hide the body from the media and bury it in secret. Bury that body in secret. And then the next day they all wake up and no one's ever heard of them before. They've been cursed to insignificance. And no matter what they do, people forget that they were ever there like 30 seconds later. And so the title was originally The Number One. So it was NO.ONES. So it read like The Number Ones. Then in the midst of the issues, that period disappears more and more. So it reads The No Ones. So I love that. That was super fun. And then I have two other indie projects that I really loved. One was called The High Cost of Happily Ever After. I had gone through a major breakup and betrayal and blah, 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 blah. And so I wanted to write something really romantic, but also schmaltzy. But I knew I could only use that language if I wrote a story that was really a dark, dark love story and fairy tale. So there was that. And then there's a supernatural thriller called The Runner, about a guy who's been on the run from the Angel of Death since 1936, that I think might be one of the best scripts I've ever written. And then lastly, other than some of my prose work, there was a one-shot I produced years and years ago that I think is going to make a comeback, called Alphabet Soups, which is a team of 26 heroes, each with a different letter of the alphabet on their chest, and whatever they spell, they transform into. So it's a way to teach spelling, but at the same time to embrace kind of the teamwork that letters have to have with each other. So, Y has kind of a split personality. Is she a vowel or a consonant? Q is codependent on U, and he can't spell anything without her. S is too possessive at times. E and I are always fighting over who should go first, you know. And it's in the midst of this story, or in the midst of these character interactions, um, completely superhumanizing the alphabet, that we get fun stories.
Those all sound very cool, and I'm struck when I asked that question that you brought up all original projects, and that was my next question. Was your work on original concepts? Is that first of all, you already described sort of where your ideas come from. I think they just well, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, you know, where how they appear, if they just kind of jump into your head and you have to sort of write them down. But I'm more like to know, you know, do you feel like as part of your writing that you always have to have the possibility of these original projects, even when you're writing some of the more established characters? Do you like that balance of having things, or if it were up to you, would you do just all original concepts?
You know, in answer to your question, I like doing both. I like taking existing IP and figuring out not only how to approach it, but how to approach it in a way that you know, just makes people love it. Like Jeff Loeb, who I helped develop Hush with years and years before Hush even came out. You know, Jeff said, Jim, you know, you seem to write the most obvious idea that no one's ever thought of before. But then once you say it, it's like, oh yeah, of course. And so I'm always looking at existing IP and saying, and looking at it and saying, what's the problem in this IP that hasn't been explained before? What's the thing that if I speak into this and I write into this, people would be like, oh yeah, oh, I'm so glad that that happened. Like a couple years ago, I wrote a Superman one shot that was about a drunken, broken down alien Green Lantern coming to Earth and begging Superman to kill him in the name of justice and mercy. And Superman's like, I don't kill. And he's like, and the Green Lantern's like, you don't understand. Billions are dead because of me. And Superman's like, but I don't kill. And the Green Lantern is like, you have to kill me. It's my fault. I was the Green Lantern in charge of protecting Krypton. All your people are dead because of me. Please end my life. And so, like, that's a giant, obvious idea, but it hadn't been told before. Or I think there was an old Tomar Ray that hinted at it, and he was off on another planet somewhere, and he didn't hear about it. But then Jeff Johns created the idea that every planet had two Green Lanterns, so I was able to tell the story of the Green Lantern that was there.
Very cool.
You know,
I mean, it's great to be able to uncover those obvious but yet not obvious enough ideas that you know, only you can sort of see.
Yeah,
it must be satisfying, I'd say.
it's more like you know how Tolkien, and I'm not comparing myself to Tolkien here. I'm just saying how Tolkien talked about how he was finding all these ancient languages in his studies, and it was in finding these words that were kind of lost words that he began to see a story beginning to form, which became the Lord of the Rings. It's kind of like that. I feel like in looking at the characters and looking at the history and stuff like that, it's more like I stumble upon something, and I'm like, oh, yeah, oh, I'm so lucky I get to write this, or take
Things
it
just
further.
sort of jump out.
Yeah, and I think that's probably, you know, how I approach it. I look at it, and it begins by me loving it. It really, like, all this stuff begins by me loving it so much that I'm going to spend hours and hours and hours thinking about it and thinking what could be done, what wasn't done, what should be done, what's the worst thing that could happen to this character. And then usually the worst thing that can happen to the character, I trace back to what's the character most afraid of happening, and then that creates the destiny to come while looking at the old stuff and what's the thing they were most afraid of, because the thing they're most afraid of is ultimately the god that rules them from within themselves. And so it always becomes that way of, how does this character ultimately triumph by having the thing they always feared happen actually happen. And so it's kind of like taking the character along a way to the point where they die and are reborn in the midst of the storyline. Not that they actually die, but
Yeah, metaphor.
They go through it and are transformed by ultimately facing their ultimate fear.
It's a very cool perspective. I'm not sure you want to give this whole secret sauce away to everybody, but I'll allow you to do it. And you know, we love what it's produced so far. And speaking of, you know, loving what, you know, the concept and what you're trying to develop, what are you doing right now? What are some current and near future projects you're working on that we can look forward to?
There's a bunch of things. So there's a company in New Zealand that for the last number of years I've been writing short stories for, moving into even writing prose. And you know, they did an anthology that mixed horror with superheroes. That again, Mark Waid, who's always been a really big encouragement to my career, he wrote the intro to it. I should say that he so liked Alphabet Soups years ago that he wrote an intro for it and ended the intro by saying, "Damn you, Jim Krueger." You know, so there's "Damn you, Jim Krueger," and then "Fuck,
Close
Jim
enough.
Krueger." You know,
Right.
it gets there. It gets there. So I've been writing stories for them, and at the end of this year, book one of two books will come out from them. I've been writing haunted Christmas stories as short stories, and one of my other longtime collaborators, John K. Schneider, already did the cover to the first one, and he'll do the second one. But the idea is you'll get 13 haunted Christmas stories in the first one and 12 haunted Christmas stories in the second one. And the ultimate goal is to have kind of an advent calendar of holiday horror in the form of short stories people can read and enjoy. They're not long stories. They're always between 2,000 and 4,000 words a story, and it's just the same. So the first one's called The Frankincense Monster and Other Creepy Christmas Stories. That's the one that'll come out this November. And then the following years will be I Saw Mommy Killing Santa Claus and Other Twisted Holiday Tales. So there's that. And then I'm also in the process of writing it's kind of half YA novel, half graphic novel for Steve Aoki as part of his Hero Quest stuff. So I've been doing a lot of work with Steve Aoki lately. And I had done Neon Future years ago with him through Tom Bilyeu and a bunch of other really gifted writers. And, you know, I met Steve I saw Steve again at a concert, and he was just like, "Oh, Jim, I'm so glad you're here. Yeah, you have to write this for me." And so I jumped into that. And so book one has already come out. I'm in the process of hopefully finishing up book two sometime this month. And then in addition to that, there's a Foot Soldiers omnibus in the works that will get some. This will be my first Kickstarter campaign, but it'll be, there's some really awesome people behind it. And the idea is we're going to do Foot Soldiers as an omnibus. And then, if all goes well, I will write a final Foot Soldiers story. It doesn't mean there will be the last story, but it means, you know, basically, I should define Foot Soldiers a little bit. It's a story in kind of a Dickensian future, very industrialized and stuff like that, where three young adults, teenagers, go to the grave where all the superheroes are buried, and they rob the graves. That's how they get their powers. They fill the actual shoes of the original heroes. And then the story is how truly hard those shoes are to fill. And so the idea is that with new stories added in, plus all the previous work done on Foot Soldiers, that will be this omnibus. And then if I get to do volume 2, and I really hope I get to, it'll be a much shorter graphic novel, of course, much more like just a 4 or 5 issue thing. But the idea is it'll take place 50 years after the events of that everyone knows of the Foot Soldiers, and it'll be the last remaining member of the team facing off against the villain who's been the primary villain of the series at the graves of all the Foot Soldiers. So will we know what happened to them? Did they die of old age? Did they go down in glory? What happened? I'm just going to speculate. So, there will be lots of stories still to tell within the universe, but it goes back to that Alan Moore legend thing, where it's like, until you know the death, until you know the end, they never become legends. And in this particular world, 50 years afterwards, they're all legends, whether the reader knows what those legends are or not.
All right, everybody. What'd you think? I really enjoyed digging into Jim's career. He had, as I said in the intro, kind of a fascinating entree into comics. It was not sort of your typical, starting out writing his own stories. It was more from a journalism background and advertising. And it was great that he struck up this friendship and collaboration with Alex Ross and was able to put together these huge projects and then continue on into his own stuff. And there's more on the way, as you heard. So thank you, Jim, for taking the time to be on the program. Thank you all out there for listening, for viewing, rating, reviewing, subscribing. Please get the word out about the Dollar Bin Bandits, and we'll see you Friday.